Agenda for the business meeting. We have in front of us 10 of our nominees that are ready to go. We have decided we're going to have a voice vote on each of them, except we're going to have a roll call vote on Puzder, Kapoor, and Rinaldi. The rest will be by a voice vote, if that is agreeable with the committee and with the ranking member. It appears to be. So let's start with Jacob Helberg of Florida to be Undersecretary of State, Economic Growth, Energy, and Environment. Is there a motion to send it to the floor? It's been moved. Seconded. Seconded that we send Jacob Helberg to the floor with a do pass recommendation. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Do you want to be recorded, Senator Merkley? Okay,
Mr. Chairman, I have some other people who would like to be recorded as no's. Can I?
Senator, I wonder if we could do, yes, obviously we'll record them as no, but can we just submit that? To,
sure, we're happy to do that.
If that's okay, all right. Let's take all the voice votes first. Benjamin Black of New York to be Chief Executive Officer of the United States International Development Finance Corporation. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved.
Second.
Seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. The floor will be so notified. Howard Brody of Florida to be Ambassador Extraordinary of the United States of America to the Republic of Finland. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Seconded.
Aye. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Luigi Rinaldi of New York to be Ambassador. Excuse
Chairman,
me.
I'd
I'm
like
sorry. That's a roll call vote. I'm sorry. Nicholas Merrick of Texas to be Ambassador to the Czech Republic. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Oops, I'm sorry. Thank you, Senator. We'll have those recorded too. Arthur Fisher of North Carolina to be Ambassador to Austria. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
Seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Roman Pipko of Florida to be Ambassador to Estonia. Is there a motion?
So second.
Moved, seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. Stacy Feinberg of California to be the Ambassador to Luxembourg. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
Been moved and seconded. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. The ayes have it. We'll now take up 3 on a roll call vote. We'll start with Andrew Puzder. Is there a motion?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded that we send Andrew Puzder to the floor with a do pass recommendation. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I was, despite my concerns about some of his responses at the hearing, I didn't get a chance to ask him questions, and I was willing to forego some of his past issues around with his first wife because she has been willing to forego that. But we just got his responses to questions. Now, this is someone who's being submitted to be ambassador to the EU. The EU is probably one of our most important allies, if not the most important ally. And the responses that we got from Mr. Puzder are just insulting. I mean, they're one sentence. These are serious questions. If confirmed, would you advocate for the seizure of Russian assets in Europe to help rebuild Ukraine? He basically says, the United States has discussed with the G7 and the European Union the disposition of immobilized Russian sovereign assets, and the administration has made clear all options remain on the table. That is not an answer to an issue that the Congress has overwhelmingly supported. So I'm going to vote against Mr. Puzder, and I think that view is shared by most of my Democratic colleagues, but I would hope that all of us on this committee would demand that people who come before us who are being appointed to these critical positions take them seriously enough to give us real answers when we have serious questions that we're asking. So I am very concerned about that. I'm willing to reconsider my vote when it comes to the floor if he shows that he's really serious about this job. But clearly by his answers, he's not serious.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. I think we've all been frustrated over the years from responses from time to time. I think that your criticism is well taken. I still think we should confirm him, and I'm going to vote to confirm him. I will urge that he sit down with you and talk through some of these, because I agree with you. First of all, this is an incredibly important position, being ambassador to the European Union. Is there further debate on the nomination? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Ricketts?
Aye.
Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Daniel? Aye. Mr. Haggerty?
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso?
Aye.
Mr. Lee?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott? Aye. Mr. Curtis? Aye. Mr. Cornyn? Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Shaheen?
No.
Mr. Coons?
No by proxy.
Mr. Murphy?
No by proxy.
Mr. King?
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Booker?
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz?
No by proxy.
Mr. Van Hollen?
No by proxy.
Ms. Duckworth?
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen? No. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas are 12, the noes are 10.
The motion is passed. The nomination will be referred to the floor with a due pass. We'll take up Paul Kapoor of California for Secretary of State for Southern Asian Affairs. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second? It's been moved and seconded that we send Paul Kapoor to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Is there debate on this nomination? Senator Shaheen.
Mr. Chairman, again, I appreciate Paul Kapoor's expertise, but I found his answer on Afghanistan totally unacceptable and not appropriate for somebody who's planning to take over the position on South Asian affairs. The fact that he's willing to send Afghans back home and not willing to acknowledge the threat that the Taliban poses to those people who have risked their lives and their families' lives to help our American servicemen and women during the war in Afghanistan is just totally unacceptable in my mind. And again, I think all of us should be concerned about that. The support for Afghans to come to the United States after they served with our troops, whether it was as interpreters or in other roles to help the United States, was something that was a bipartisan position. It was something that I have worked on with John McCain for many years. There are others on this committee who have worked on that. And the fact that we would put somebody in that position who didn't have the backbone to stand up and say that the Taliban are a threat and we shouldn't be sending Afghans back because we know they're going to get killed is not acceptable. So I intend to vote against him. I would hope that if he's approved, which it appears based on where the rest of this committee is, that will happen. But I would hope that people would share with him concerns about what that position means to future countries who we might be asking to join us and help our men and women on the ground in combat. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. I'm sure that Mr. Kapoor is going to get a lot of advice in directions that you have just lobbied for here and spoke for as we go forward. I'm going to vote in favor of Mr. Kapoor. Is there further debate?
Mr. Chairman,
Senator Merkley.
I think we should recognize that when we fail to stand by those who stood by us in Afghanistan, we're not just betraying our implicit promise to them, but we are endangering American enterprises in the future around the world where we need the cooperation and support of local individuals. If we betray now those who were so critical in supporting our mission and often supporting and saving the lives of Americans, then why should anybody partner with us in the future? His position is completely unacceptable, and I would hope we'd all recognize that and not forward this nomination.
Thank you, Senator Merkley. Is there further debate on the nomination? Not, clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Ricketts?
Aye.
Mr. McCormick? Aye. Mr. Daniel?
Aye.
Mr. Haggerty?
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso? Mr. Lee?
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Paul?
By proxy.
Mr. Scott. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Cornyn.
By proxy.
Ms. Shaheen.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Murphy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kane.
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley. No. Mr. Booker. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Van Hollen.
I'm sorry. Mr. Schatz is a no by proxy. I need to correct. Mr. Kane was an aye by proxy. Mr. Van Hollen is no by proxy. You want to start over?
Start with Senator Booker. Mr. Booker.
Senator Booker is no by proxy.
Mr. Schatz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Van Hollen.
No by proxy.
Ms. Duckworth.
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen.
No.
Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas are 13, the noes are 9.
The motion has passed. The nomination will be sent to the floor with the committee's recommendation. Lastly, we have Luigi Rinaldi of New York to be ambassador to Uruguay. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Second? It's been moved and seconded that Mr. Rinaldi be sent to the floor with a due pass. Is there a debate? Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, again, Mr. Rinaldi was not someone I had the opportunity to question because I wasn't able to stay at his hearing the full time. But Uruguay has become a very important ally in Latin America, and it's very distressing that Mr. Rinaldi didn't seem to have any understanding at all about the country, about the role of ambassador, about what we need to do going forward. So I intend to vote against him.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Is there further debate? If not, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Ricketts.
Aye.
Mr. McCormick. Aye. Mr. Daines.
Aye.
Mr. Hagerty.
Aye.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Lee. Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Paul. Aye. Mr. Cruz. Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Curtis. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Aye by proxy.
Aye by proxy.
Ms. Shaheen.
No.
Mr. Coons.
No by proxy.
Mr. Murphy.
No by proxy.
Mr. Kane.
No by proxy.
Mr. Merkley.
No by proxy. Oops. I'm glad we're in agreement.
Mr. Booker.
No by proxy.
Mr. Schatz.
No by proxy.
Mr. Van Hollen.
No by proxy.
Ms. Duckworth.
No by proxy.
Ms. Rosen. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, the yeas are 12 and the noes are 10.
Thank you. The motion is passed. Mr. Rinaldi be sent to the floor with a due pass recommendation. That concludes our business meeting. Thank you to the members for showing up as quickly as we can to move these. I know it's everybody's got lots of moving parts here, but we appreciate your cooperation. And that concludes our business meeting. And from there, we're going to move to a policy hearing. And this morning's hearing is on the NATO Summit of 2025 on assessment of transatlantic security cooperation. Obviously, this is coming up quite soon. We don't have an ambassador in place. The ranking member and I have been discussing that. I think both of us are of the frame of mind that we need our ambassador in place. We hope we can get the cooperation to move it forward, notwithstanding everything else that's going on. But this is particularly at this point in time with what's happening in Europe. It's important we have a ambassador there. To our witnesses, thank you, and we'll get to you in a moment. I'm going to make an opening statement, yield to Senator Shaheen, who will do so. We will then hear from each of you your thoughts, and we really, really appreciate you coming here to talk with us today. And then we'll go with a round of questions for the witnesses. So NATO was founded in 1949 to protect the United States and transatlantic partners from the aggression of those who seek to harm us. In fact, it was Russian aggression in a divided Berlin that finally convinced our partners to sign the treaty. The world has endured a lot in the past 76 years since then, but NATO has played a crucial role in preserving stability and security. It is this security that has provided room for enormous U.S. and European economic prosperity. Today, as in times past, NATO must adapt to new changes and new challenges. Our alliance faces unprecedented threats from a rising China, a belligerent Russia, and rogue actors in Iran, North Korea, and elsewhere. This year's NATO Summit presents a unique opportunity to assess the threats facing our alliance and the response they demand from us if we hope to maintain the security and stability the world has enjoyed for so long, much of it due to what NATO offers us. Over the last decade, but particularly the last 3 years, Putin's aggression has created the largest security crisis in Europe since the Second World War. In 2014, Russia invaded Ukraine for the first time, and Europe did little to deter further aggression. After the full-scale invasion in 2022, Europe leaders made momentous pledges to take more responsibility. 3 years on, Europe still has a long way to go. Since January 20th, President Trump has worked diligently to determine whether peace between Ukraine and Russia is possible, and we strongly support his efforts to secure a lasting peace in the region. Russia's actions demonstrate an unwillingness to support peace and a preference for war to continue, a war that has already radically reshaped the security landscape in Europe and proving one indisputable fact: NATO is more relevant than ever and will be for decades to come. There are still actors who seek to subvert America, our allies, and the values we hold dear. Russia's invasion of Ukraine proved that we do not live in a, quote, post-conflict era, end quote. As Secretary General Ruda has pointed out, Russia could be ready to use military force against a NATO nation within a few years. We can only defend against these threats together, but there are still members of NATO that take the alliance and U.S. support for granted. For decades, our European allies have left the heavy lifting to America, and by their own admission, did not pull their own weight in defense spending. This is starting to change, thankfully. NATO has always succeeded because there was no first or second tier membership. Unanimity in voting guarantees sovereignty, and equality is respected. However, the failure of Europe to spend appropriately on defense started to create the very tiers that NATO worked to avoid. Europeans must make dramatic investment in their defense. U.S. taxpayers will not continue to foot their bill. Thanks to President Trump's leadership since he first came to office, I believe Europe now understands this. Many of us on this committee have underscored that issue with them when we meet with them. The number of allies fulfilling their defense spending pledges has risen from 6 members in 2017, when President Trump first took office, to 23 today, with many more presenting plans to reach 2% by the end of this year. This is great progress, and I'm glad that Secretary General Ruda has called for greater defense investment and production capacity across NATO. Our allies must agree to raise defense spending levels to 5% of their GDP, and not through defense-adjacent expenditures. That means increasing production of defense capabilities, equipment, recruitment, and developing innovative technologies that enhance lethality. Many of these topics will be discussed at the NATO Summit in June, and I look forward to seeing the outcomes of those conversations. After all, Russia is not the only threat NATO faces. NATO's security umbrella does not and should not cover Asia, but Iran, North Korea, and China actively support Russia's war in Ukraine. These authoritarian actors are not operating in silos, and NATO can't think of them as such. Indeed, China poses risks to NATO military readiness. The alliance must set standards for its members to guard against malign Chinese investments and supply chain vulnerabilities that threaten NATO's security in Europe. Above all, we must remember that we are united. There may be disagreements from trade to technology, but the threats we face are existential, and none of us can face them alone. NATO is still the most successful political and military organization in the history of this planet. Adversaries who seek to do us harm would be wise to recognize that fact. I'm grateful to our witnesses for being with us today and look forward to a productive conversation on the future of the NATO alliance. With that, I yield to the distinguished ranking member, Senator Shaheen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to both of our witnesses today. We appreciate your willingness to sit through our business meeting while we wait for your testimony. I want to actually begin by going to a different region of the world and expressing my concern about the conflict between Israel and Iran, because the exchange of missile attacks not only endangers our partners in the region, but also the safety of American service members, diplomats, and their families. And I asked Secretary Hegseth about this at an earlier hearing. We have 40,000 troops in the region, many of whom are within range of Iranian missiles, and he was not at all clear about what we're doing to protect those service members. Mr. Chairman, I hope that we will ask the administration on the part of this committee for a briefing on what's going on in this area.
Thank you. We've talked about that, and we're going to try to make that happen.
Great.
Sheen.
Thank you.
That's a legitimate request.
One of the things that this conflict does is it makes the upcoming NATO summit and the need for international partners, as the chairman has said, even more consequential. As co-chair of the Senate NATO Observer Group, I will be attending the summit along with Senator Tillis, and we hope to have a good bipartisan delegation from the Senate. The support for NATO is also reflected here at home. A recent Pew Research poll found that nearly 2/3 of U.S. adults see a benefit to NATO membership. Our European allies feel the same, despite the rhetoric and the trade practices from this administration. Our allies continue to recognize NATO's value, perhaps now more than ever. According to official figures, 23 out of NATO's 32 member states currently meet or exceed the defense spending threshold of 2%. And as the chairman said, I certainly agree with him in hoping that out of this summit will come an agreement to adopt 5% as the new defense spending target at the Hague Summit. In fact, Sweden and the Netherlands just announced plans to spend 5% of GDP on defense. And these increases are not the result of trade policies or tariffs. They are a direct response to Russian aggression, to Vladimir Putin's willingness to lay waste to Ukraine. As NATO Secretary General Rutte has said, and I quote, "We are all on the eastern flank now." The reality of this shared vulnerability is clear. If Putin wins in Ukraine, he will not stop there. He's already sent troops into Belarus. He threatens the Balkans, the Baltic states, and the Black Sea. And Russia's ambitions also continue to play out over our own borders through the Kremlin's repeated attacks on our financial institutions and energy infrastructure. That's why I don't understand the administration's continued refusal to lower the price cap for Russian oil sanctions at the G7. It would have put more pressure on Putin. I think Congress needs to act, and we have legislation supported by 82 members of the Senate that will put in place additional sanctions on Vladimir Putin. I think we should get that done as soon as possible. I also think that we shouldn't stop there, that NATO membership should be on the table for Ukraine. NATO's open door policy enshrined in the Washington Treaty should not be up for negotiation to satisfy what Vladimir Putin wants, but its membership should determine who has the opportunity to get into the alliance, and Ukraine's membership would strengthen that. They have the largest army in Europe, the most experienced army in Europe at this point. And we are developing cutting-edge countermeasures based on Ukraine's real-time experience against Russian systems. We should also not forget the power of alliances in taking on adversaries like Russia or Iran or others. As Senator Risch has rightly said, the NATO alliance is the most successful political and defensive organization that's ever been on the face of the planet. I agree with that, and I hope our witnesses today can speak to the full picture for NATO, the challenges that NATO should address at this year's summit, as well as the opportunities and advantages that NATO offers each of its members. So I very much look forward to hearing your thoughts and to our discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. We have now two distinguished witnesses we're going to hear from. I'd ask you to keep your remarks to about 5 minutes. You're going to get questions from the committee. If you have if you have other remarks or you go beyond 5 minutes, if you put them in writing for the record, we will see that they are included in the record of this hearing. And again, we sincerely appreciate you coming here. We're going to start with Mr. Peter Rowe. He's a senior fellow and director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, where he focuses on U.S. national security, defense, and foreign policy toward Europe. He writes and comments on U.S. foreign policy and regularly briefs official delegations, news media, public intellectuals, academics, and business leaders, and convenes several-track 1.5 dialogues. In the past, Mr. Rowe served as the White House Office of Strategic Initiatives, USAID, and U.S. Army Special Operations Command Strategic Initiatives Group. He holds his BA from the George Washington University and MA in Law and Diplomacy from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's a member of the boards of the American Main Street Initiative, the Bastion Institute, and has been named a next-generation leader at several think tanks, including the Munich Security Conference, which we all know. Mr. Rowe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman Risch, Ranking Member Shaheen, and members of the committee. Thank you for the honor of testifying today and for your attention to the upcoming NATO Summit. My name is Peter Rowe, and I'm the director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at Hudson Institute. My views are my own and should not be construed as representing the position of Hudson. With your permission, I'd like to take this opportunity to summarize my written testimony, which I'd like to submit for the record. For starters, it's worth repeating that Europe remains of vital importance to the United States, with the stock of two-way foreign direct investment totaling $7.5 trillion US dollars in 2023. In fact, the Netherlands, host of next week's NATO Summit, holds the largest FDI position in the United States of any country in the world. Worryingly, the peace and prosperity of Europe are under threat. Russia's reconstitution of its Leningrad military district, de facto takeover of Belarus, plans to expand and enlarge its ground forces, establishment of bases and rail networks along the Russian-Finnish border, and waves of hybrid attacks have all reinforced the truth that Russia remains implacably hostile to the alliance. A recent Danish intelligence assessment even characterized Russian rearmament as having, quote, changed character from reconstruction to an intensified military buildup, end quote. As NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte put it rather dramatically last week, Europe now faces a choice: either invest in defense or learn to speak Russian. That message is resonating. 2 weeks ago, defense ministers in Brussels agreed to new capability targets that represent, on average, a 30% increase over existing goals. At the NATO Summit, the alliance will agree to a new investment pledge, 5% of gross domestic product for defense, of which 3.5% is to be set aside for hard power, while 1.5% is to be earmarked for related costs, such as cybersecurity and infrastructure. Central to this breakthrough is Germany, which has taken up the mantle of leadership under its new chancellor, Friedrich Merz. In a refreshing break from its recent past, Germany is now committed to convert its economic power into military capabilities. This sets up a new NATO bargain, 5 for 5. In return for NATO adopting its new defense spending target, President Trump should reiterate the United States' ironclad commitment to Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, which obligates member states to mutual defense. To turn promises into reality, NATO should consider supplementing its defense ministerials with a finance ministerial, comprised of allied ministers of finance, many of whom in parliamentary democracies control their country's purse strings. There is no bigger deterrent to Russian aggression in Europe than forward-deployed U.S. forces. In his own words, General Cavoli has, quote, consistently recommended, end quote, that we maintain our current force posture to counteract Russia's local superiority on the eastern flank of the alliance. As we have seen this week, U.S. bases in Europe project American power into other theaters. The KC-135 Stratotankers and KC-46 Pegasuses that deployed from the United States on Sunday and Monday are now at air bases in Spain, Greece, Germany, Italy, and the United Kingdom, as the president weighs his options on Iran. Our ambassador to NATO, Ambassador Whitaker, has promised to, quote, make sure that there are no security gaps, end quote, in Europe as the U.S. undertakes its global force posture review. This will be especially important for the strategic enablers which Europe still lacks. Russia cannot take on NATO on its own. Unfortunately, it now enjoys close defense industrial ties with the People's Republic of China, whose supply of machine tools and microelectronics have powered the Russian war on Ukraine. Russia's drones, which now count for more casualties in Ukraine than any other weapon system, are derivatives of Iran's Shahed family of unmanned aerial vehicles. Meanwhile, North Korean shells now make up half of all Russian artillery fired in certain sectors of the front line. Earlier this year, a division-sized force of North Korean troops played a decisive role in Russia's counteroffensive in Kursk Oblast. In return, Russia has provided each of its partners with diplomatic, technological, and economic benefits. If the U.S. cannot prevent the alignment of these revisionist actors, it should at the very least vector Europe's stark opposition to Russia into a tougher transatlantic stance against China, Iran, and North Korea. As the president suggested at the G7 2 days ago, whatever sanctions Europeans are requesting of the United States should be mirrored by similar actions from our allies on the continent. Finally, given the presence of major war in Eastern Europe, no NATO summit can ignore the plight of Ukraine. It is not expected that Ukraine will receive significant mention in the summit declaration, but leaders should plan now rather than later for how to support Ukraine as U.S. congressional funding runs out over the coming months. Europe will fill gaps and shoulder much of the load, but for those systems that Europe cannot replace, NATO leaders should begin exploring U.S. attitudes towards either another supplemental or direct military sales. For example, the U.S. could backfill Europe's air defenses as those countries transfer interceptors to Ukraine. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to Dr. Alina Polyakova, and she is President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, where she focuses on transatlantic relations and European security. She's also the Donald Marin Senior Fellow at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Previously, she has held roles at the Brookings Institution and Atlantic Council, among others. She has also held numerous prestigious fellowships, including at the National Science Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson International School for Center for Scholars, and the Fulbright Foundation, among others. She serves on the board of the Free Russia Foundation and is a member of the Leadership Council for Women in National Security and the Scientific Council of the Elcano Royal Institute. She holds a PhD and MA in Sociology from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's in Economics and Sociology from Emory University. Dr. Polyakova, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Chairman Risch and Ranking Member Shaheen and distinguished members of the committee. It is a true honor to address you today on a critical matter of U.S. national security, the 2025 NATO Summit. I should note that the views expressed in this testimony do not reflect those of the Center for European Policy Analysis, of which I'm President and CEO, or its staff and fellows. The NATO Summit in The Hague next week convenes at a pivotal moment as the transatlantic community confronts an increasingly volatile geopolitical landscape marked by Russia's war in Ukraine and the growing cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, who collectively aim to undermine the United States and our allies. Therefore, the summit represents a powerful opportunity for the United States to engage with allies as they commit to massive new defense spending levels. Because as was true at NATO's founding and is still the case today, the alliance remains central to the vital national security interests of defending the U.S. homeland. NATO's European allies are poised to commit to 5% of GDP to defense spending, which is a significant and appropriate level given the growing Russian threat to NATO and the broader geopolitical environment. This new commitment signifies a profound transformation, positioning Europe as an example for other partners, a point very aptly made by Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in his remarks to Indo-Pacific partners last month. Indeed, the Trump administration deserves a great deal of credit for pushing European allies to step up in such a significant way on defense. Therefore, U.S. leadership, both from the executive branch and also from the members of Congress, will be instrumental in ensuring that these financial commitments translate into concrete defense capabilities that will ultimately benefit global U.S. national security interests. Showing allied unity at the summit will serve as an important deterrent. In my written testimony, I provide specific examples on 3 key points that I'll summarize here. First, Europe is indeed stepping up, but U.S. leadership and commitment in principle, people, and resources remain critical for NATO's continued success as the strongest military alliance in history. European allies are taking the right steps by setting these ambitious spending targets to rebalance the burden-sharing relationship. And as Secretary General Rutte recently said, it is in all our interest to have a NATO that is stronger, fairer, and more lethal. But while Europe takes up the challenge, there is no magic wand that would allow European allies to produce a highly competent force that can deploy rapidly across the continent. That requires years of planning, as our military commanders will likely confirm. Europe would be a sitting duck for Putin without U.S. presence, capabilities, and political leadership for NATO. the U.S. is indeed the indispensable nation for NATO and the key enabler for European capabilities as the alliance confronts Putin's growing appetite to use military force in Europe. Number two, Russia is the threat today to NATO that we feared it was at the beginning of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. As General Cavoli recently testified, Russia's military has shown a remarkable ability to adapt and reconstitute. Thanks to support from its partners, Russia is also carrying out an increasingly aggressive shadow war against NATO in Europe, and it is on a path to long-term societal militarization. These are trends that we did not see even during the Cold War era, and NATO is now well positioned to respond to the dual challenges of Russia's conventional and non-conventional threats. This means that Russia's actions are signaling that Russia will prepare and is actively preparing for a direct military confrontation with NATO, and we need a common and comprehensive strategy to respond to this threat. Number three, my last point, NATO's open door policy is a core asset to the alliance and the United States. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has doubled in size from 16 to 32 members. The integration of the former Soviet bloc states in the 90s and early 2000s has ensured not only stability in Europe, it ensured that these countries would be the strongest pro-American allies, which is still the case today. The most recent inclusion of Finland and Sweden has added significantly to NATO's capabilities, force posture, and strategic depth. Ukraine will also be a significant asset to NATO, bringing the largest, most battle-tested army to Europe with the most cutting-edge capabilities. With that, I yield the rest of my time, and I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Well, again, thank you to both of you. You both have deep knowledge of the matter that is near and dear to everybody's heart on this committee. We embrace NATO and want to see it continue to prosper. It's, I believe, truly stronger today than it's ever been. Putin seems to never miss an opportunity to make a mistake, and the mistakes he's made has actually done a lot to strengthen NATO. Not the least of which is to add 2 new members and the considerably longer border of his with NATO. So we're going to continue to support NATO in every way we can. I have a question for each, and I'd like your thoughts. I believe, although Putin has made a lot of mistakes, there's a mistake I think he won't make, and that is I don't think he will engage militarily a NATO country. We have committed to our allies that Article 5 means exactly what it says. That includes the Baltic states and everybody between there and Los Angeles. And I personally met with the Baltics right after the invasion of Ukraine. They were concerned, and I assured them that our position and policy of the United States is not 1 square inch of NATO ground will be given up, not 1 square inch. I think that message has been conveyed to Putin loud and clear. I think he understands it, and I don't think he'll make that mistake, which would be a disaster for his country. Your thoughts, please, starting with you, Mr. Rowe.
Well, sir, I think that deterrence is a matter of capabilities and will, and I would just submit there could be 3 or 4 measures that NATO might want to undertake to strengthen Article 5. Number one, Putin has been undertaking a campaign of hybrid attacks, numbering in the dozens, if not hundreds, of incidents across the NATO alliance for years now. It might be worth considering calling an Article 4 meeting of the North Atlantic Council to discuss how to push back and deter against these hybrid attacks. Operation Baltic Sentry kicked off in January to guard against sabotage attacks, but thus far information sharing and some legal action have been the only pushback we've seen from the alliance on this. Secondly, speaking of the Baltics, it might be worth considering upgrading the battle group in Estonia to a brigade level. We have this now in Lithuania thanks to the German brigade as of last month, which was activated. And quite frankly, the Estonians have invested more in long-range fires and pre-positioning stocks. It's very expensive to host a brigade. But really the issue there is the framework nation, the UK, only has 2 maneuverable heavy brigades in the British Army today. We need to find a way, I think, to deploy more forward in that instance. And then third, it might be worthwhile considering the alliance in Romania and Poland shooting down missiles and drones which are violating NATO airspace. We've seen drones land across the Danube in Romania. We've seen a missile impact in eastern Poland and killing farmers in Poland. That would be a measure that I don't think would be escalatory, but could help reinforce the Article 5, which is so important.
Good thoughts. Doctor?
I actually agree completely with my colleague. I think your question is a really important one, Chairman, because I would have agreed with you a few years ago that Russia would not risk a direct confrontation with NATO. I think at this point, seeing the trends in Russia's military capabilities, reconstitution, adaptation, the buildup in Russian forces, there is no other reason to do that unless you're expecting a confrontation with a much larger potential adversary than Ukraine. Because just to fight the war in Ukraine, Russia doesn't need to do what it's currently doing. So that is a very clear signal that there are long-term strategic plans. I'm not sure that it will happen in the next 5 years, as the Secretary General Rutte said, but certainly no longer a 20 or 25-year horizon. That being said, I think whether that happens or not depends a huge amount on the United States in particular. Some of the recommendations that my colleague, Mr. Rao, made in supporting the eastern flank are critical. Russia will be deterred if it sees that we are acting from a position of strength, and we are there with our allies. I think in addition to what Peter has just suggested, I think there's huge opportunities in learning from Ukraine's deployment of autonomous systems in the Black Sea in particular, as well as what our allies have been doing in the Nordic-Baltic region to further push back and also provide more ISR capabilities so that we can at least have a red flag warning if we are seeing some sort of confrontation emerging from Russia. But I think the shadow war or hybrid threats that Russia has been carrying out across Europe are significant, and they are very aggressive, and we have very, very few deterrent capabilities there.
Good thoughts from all of you. Thank you. Senator Shaheen.
Well, thank you both very much for your testimony. Dr. Polyakova, I was really struck by your talking about the increased militarization of Russian society, because I have continued to believe that one of the most important reasons to support Ukraine is because it sends a very strong message to not just our allies and partners that we would be there for them, but to our adversaries who threaten the United States. And it was pointed out to me recently that one of the other really important aspects of that is that we do not want to be in a position 5 or 10 years down the road where Russia actually is able to absorb Ukraine and has access to all of the increased buildup that Ukraine has done and their expertise, technology, innovation to go against NATO and our other allies and partners. Can you talk about that and how you calibrate that concern against other issues with respect to Russia?
Well, thank you so much for that question, Senator Shaheen. It is true that the militarization of Russian society is not new, but it has accelerated significantly since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And what I mean by that is that there is consistent reporting that, for example, children as young as kindergarten age are receiving military drill education. And this is continues on through the school ages and, of course, up to the years of military service. And this is deeply, deeply concerning for a variety of reasons, as you can imagine. That being said, to your point about what would be the consequences if Russia was able to eventually completely take over Ukraine, the first consequence is how expensive it would be for NATO to then have a Ukraine that is completely occupied and controlled together with Belarus, together with Russia's positions in Kaliningrad as well, to defend and deter against that. That's going to cost us a lot more than what we're already spending and what our European allies are spending on Ukraine. So there's a real expense there, aside from the security threat. I think broadly speaking, it's important to remember that Russia is a strategic and direct threat to the United States, not just our allies in Ukraine. It seeks to undermine as a core objective the United States as its position as a global leader. That is what the war in Ukraine is at the end of the day about. It is not about some territory in the Donetsk region. It's not about Crimea. It's about deposing the United States as the leader of the free world. And that is the key objective. And that is why Russia has partnerships with China and others.
And do you think this administration and this president recognize that?
I think there are certainly members of the administration who do recognize that. Personally, I would like to see that message be very, very clear to our allies at the summit. I think the one question that a lot of our European allies have is, are we aligned on the threat perception? between all the NATO partners, not just the United States? Do we have the same understanding of the threat that Russia represents? And I think if we can get some movement in that at the summit, that would be very significant.
Mr. Rao, can you answer that question as well?
Well, I would note that American weapons continue to transit via Poland into Ukraine. There is a sanctions regime in place, even if we can quibble about the size and scope of it, as well as sanctions enforcement. And the United States is a member of NATO. Just 2 weeks ago, NATO held a defense ministerial on the sidelines of which the Ukraine NATO Council met, as well as the Ukraine Defense Contact Group. 20 billion euros in new security assistance has been pledged this year. So while the U.S. is adopting this mediating role, this form of neutrality almost between Ukraine and Russia, it's neutral bending towards Ukraine, I would say. And go ahead, Senator.
Thank you. Are either of you surprised that Russia has not come to the aid of Iran in the current conflict with Israel? That they're not providing the weapons, or at least news reports are that they're not providing the weapons that Iran has requested?
I do think it was notable that in the phone call the president held with President Putin, there was a heavy section on Iran, and the president even said explicitly in his own readout that they focused very little on Ukraine. So I do think that President Putin is trying to vector the Americans against the Israelis and to try to shut down the war so that the Iranians can recover. In that sense, I think he is carrying diplomatic water, the Russians are, for the Iranians. But I see no evidence of direct military transfers to date or anything of that nature.
Just very briefly, I'm not surprised because Russia is not a reliable partner. And we saw this in Syria as well. They tried to protect Bashar al-Assad, but then when the fall of his regime came, the Russians were nowhere to be found. And I think that's the real message that I hope we can also convey across the world as the United States.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Shaheen. Senator Ricketts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses here to testify today. At the 75th anniversary of NATO Summit in Washington last year, conversations about the Indo-Pacific took the stage in ways they never had before. The alliance's decision to deepen engagement with regional partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand signals a shift in strategic priorities. This was also recognition that Europe and the Indo-Pacific are linked. NATO's European members are now deploying assets to the region, signing on to joint exercises, coordinating cyber and hybrid defense cooperation with Indo-Pacific allies. Additionally, the summit's endorsement of the NATO Indo-Pacific partnership, along with the growing defense industrial links between South Korea, Japan, and the European NATO members, as well as AUKUS, marks an evolution in the alliance's posture. Mr. Rao, what is the real value of NATO's Indo-Pacific outreach, and what should the future coordination look like?
Well, for one, I think it's in the American vital interest that there is a pro-American balance of power on both ends of the Eurasian landmass. And if the Russians are going to forge tight links with the Chinese, the North Koreans, and the Iranians, then I think it behooves us to try to bring together lessons learned on both sides of the Eurasian landmass, to learn lessons on defense industrial-based cooperation. You'll note that that Poland recently signed a major procurement deal with South Korea for the provision of tanks, for example. And so I think there is a lot of mutual support that can be undertaken in the free world amongst partners and allies, and we can share a common threat perception, which I think is also useful. That's one of the reasons why I think NATO should be a Russia-focused continental deterrence organization, nonetheless has a role in being active in the Indo-Pacific because it can see exactly what is taking place, how China's aggression is unfolding, and I think that's a useful exercise for our partners.
Are there practical steps that NATO could do to develop meaningful co-development defense technologies in the region?
Well, for starters, NATO sought to open a liaison office in Tokyo. That was ultimately blocked by the French. I think there are opportunities for tighter linkage there. Clearly, Japan and South Korea have first-rate, cutting-edge technology and defense industrial-based capabilities, which our European partners could learn from, and I would just encourage more collaboration in all of those areas.
Mm-hmm. In your opening remarks, you mentioned about the 5 for 5, NATO going to a 5% of GDP defense spending target. And this will include 3.5% for core military spending and 1.5% for broader defense and security related measures. Obviously, at the Wales Summit in 2014, we saw NATO committing to 2%, and it took a decade for most of the allies to start even getting in that direction. Today's threat environment doesn't really allow for a decade to get to 5%. As I mentioned in your written testimony, you said you would ratify a new 5% goal should be achieved in a 5-year horizon. Can you tell us why it's so important we get that so soon rather than taking 7 to 10 years to achieve this target?
Well, simply put, the intelligence assessments all suggest that there is an urgent threat and that Russia is rebuilding. It's standing up the new 44th Army Corps in Karelia opposite Finland. The new targets for the Russian armed forces are to put 1.5 million men under arms. All of that suggests that Russia will be facing NATO once the war in Ukraine is ultimately wound down, if it is wound down. And so I think it's very important that we begin to take those measures. It's not just the time horizon, but on top of that, I think very carefully crafting what the categories are for 3.5 and 1.5% of GDP, so that areas like climate spending, for example, don't count towards defense-adjacent military expenditures.
Yeah. Dr. Polyakova, do you have anything you want to add to that with regard to the 5%?
I completely agree, and I think the reason that it has to happen much more rapidly than we've seen in the past is that Europe really has no choice at this point. I think there's broad recognition of that. Would I like to see European allies commit to 5% on core defense spending, not the 3.5, 1.5 split? Yes. This is, I see as a step to get there, but not the ultimate conclusion. I would like to see them continue spend, but I think if they move in that direction, we need to also spend more on our defense because we're below 3.5% right now. So that would be the counterpoint there.
Great, thanks. I've only just got a few seconds of time left. Mr. Rao, you wrote a little bit in your thing about AI diffusion. Can you talk a little bit about what the previous policy was, for example, so insulting to our allies like Poland?
Well, in January, the outgoing Biden administration issued an AI diffusion rule that essentially tiered our allies into different categories for AI chips. And Poland, since you mentioned it, was considered a Category 2 partner, meaning it didn't have access to certain AI chips. And this could have implications for the rollout of 6G. It could have implications for the types of software embedded in different weapon systems like the F-35. And so I think the European Commission, and in particular our Eastern European allies, who never understood, and this is directly, I think, the case for Warsaw, why they were placed in Category 2, are pleased that the Trump administration has lifted that diffusion rule.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Polyakova. Your testimony, you note, for long-term strategic security and stability, there is no better answer than Ukraine's membership in NATO. Ukraine's strategic value to NATO and European defense is profound. And you go on to note the many values that come from that battlefield experience, defense industrial base, countering hybrid threats, geographic location, strategic position. So, given that, how do you assess the impact of Trump administration's stated opposition to Ukraine's NATO membership?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I would say it's not just the United States that opposes NATO membership for Ukraine right now. There is no consensus on that among allies. And we saw that in the previous administration as well, that there was no consensus on that among allies under the Biden administration. That being said, I think while there is an active hot war in Ukraine, it's difficult to see how Ukraine could become a NATO member. But it is a goal that we should keep open in the future. And the reason for that is not because it's Ukraine and it's our duty or some sort of moral obligations, because Ukraine is a huge asset. It's the largest country in Europe. Giving Ukraine over to the Russians would be a huge hit to our military capabilities. They would absorb all of their innovative capabilities they've developed for the last 3.5 years. So I think seeing Ukraine as an asset for Europe's defense industrial base, as an asset for our own military, versus a vulnerability is the key. But it is a long-term path, not an immediate path.
No, that's helpful. There's even a provision in the NATO protocols that says you cannot bring into membership a nation that is partially occupied, so that we're not bringing NATO into an immediate conflict. And does this give you kind of any reflections on how quickly Trump basically stated support for Russia's position, that Ukraine never become part of NATO?
Well, I hope that the president will change that position. I think he has said different things, and the message could be more clear. Again, I think the ultimate desire by the administration, the president, to reach some sort of lasting, peaceful, negotiated solution between Russia and Ukraine has the right instinct. I think the reality is that Russia plays the obstructionist obstacle here, and the Ukrainians have come to the table at every moment. And I think recognizing that is key. And I think taking things off the table before we are even at the table, so to say, is the real problem.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Let me turn to another piece of the puzzle. And that is the U.S. certainly provides a nuclear umbrella for NATO, but Trump's statements that imply that our commitment to NATO is perhaps not rock solid. How does that affect the role of our nuclear umbrella and the possibility of other nations starting to consider whether they need a different strategy?
There is no substitute for the U.S. nuclear umbrella in Europe. The European allies of NATO that do have nuclear capability are far, far below, and it would take many, many years and a complete rewriting of NATO, frankly, and the founding treaty and the Washington Treaty to have some sort of different arrangement between NATO allies in Europe for them to provide for their own nuclear capability and defense umbrella. So that's really not even an option, frankly. I will say that when I speak to European allies, they're not concerned that the United States will recommit to Article 5. What they're more concerned about, of course, is a very quick drawdown of U.S. presence in Europe, which we believe is going to happen at some point. They understand that's coming. They want it to be thoughtful, strategic, and not sudden. And they are willing to step in and take more responsibility. But I will say I don't see as much concern right now, anyway, that the United States will not support NATO and recommit to Article 5.
Okay. No, and thank you very much. And Mr. Is it Ralph? Appreciated your testimony, and I wanted to ask you about the implications for NATO of China's support for Russia's war in Ukraine, and how might Beijing be drawing lessons from the West's response as it considers its ambitions towards Taiwan?
Well, first of all, China's support to the Russian war effort has been essential. It is a dubious proposition that Russia could maintain the high operational tempo it has without Chinese provision of dual-use technologies to the Russian armed forces, and in particular, this applies to the overwhelming support of microelectronics, semiconductors, and machine tools that have been very important to the Russians. As to what lessons the Chinese are drawing, I'm sure they're scrubbing down the Russian war effort very carefully. We ourselves have stood up so-called JTEC, a NATO outfit in Poland, to try to learn lessons from the war in Ukraine. But I will say, I worry that Russia and Ukraine can iterate at a much faster rate than the United States, observing this war from a distance, and even from the forward post in Poland can observe. And I think that is something that the alliance does need to address. Are we able to keep pace with the cutting edge evolutions in drone technologies, for example? The Ukrainians are more than eager to share these lessons, in a way thanking us for our generosity and support to Ukraine, but that will probably require industry and even presence in Ukraine closer to the action to understand what is happening. But there's no doubt that the Chinese are watching this very closely. And we've already seen Xi Jinping scrub down his own armed forces to try to push out corruption, doubtlessly aware of the corruption that plagued the Russian armed forces and therefore caused their underperformance in the opening days of the war.
Thank you very much.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, and thank both of you for your testimony here. And Dr.
Senator Van Hollen, I'm sorry.
That's
Senator
what I thought.
Coons is next.
Okay.
And I know he's got to get back to another hearing, so I apologize.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for your patience. I'm the ranking member on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. We are having the Army budget hearing right now. And the discussion you were just having about innovation, agility, and iteration is actually a big piece of what's being discussed downstairs. So, Mr. Rao, you agree that Russia is an adversary of the United States and that the Ukrainians have inflicted significant damage?
Yes.
My understanding over the last 3 years, Ukraine's imposed enormous costs on one of our principal global adversaries, more than 1 million casualties, half the Black Sea Fleet, thousands of Russian tanks destroyed. I could go on, without a single American soldier directly in harm's way for less than 1% of our federal budget, while modernizing our own stocks through replenishment. I continue to be all in terms of our support for Ukraine in their war against Russian aggression, as are many of my colleagues, both Republican and Democrat. It's a worthy investment in our national security. But you raised what I think is the critical question. How quickly can we learn from the EW, UAS, counter-UAS experiences of the Ukrainians and implement it not just in the U.S. Armed Forces, but among our NATO allied forces? What recommendations do you have about how we can strengthen and increase the speed of that iteration?
Well, there are a few lessons. The first is, I think, to get defense punch, you do have to have strong top-line numbers, and even the FY26 request with reconciliation monies built in is around 3%. That's a long ways away from, for example, what Senator Wicker recommended last year, peace through strength, or what the NATO allies will describe next week as the new defense investment pledge. But within that, I think it's very important to focus on procurement numbers. The Wales Pledge had a scheme where it was 2% of GDP for defense, but 20% of those 2% went to procurement, and I think that's worth keeping in mind. What some of my colleagues in the Center for Defense Concepts and Technology at Hudson have described is the value of looking to the commercial base to find solutions for defense problems. This helps reduce costs and also accelerate the speed of adaptation. Modularity, I think, is also something worth studying, rather than expensive, exquisite, bespoke systems. And then the economies of scale that we can achieve through our joint procurement projects is something I think we should look at. Europe has some 12 tanks because, of course, it is a mosaic of nations, more than a continent acting in the defense sphere together. And joint procurement would be a worthy thing. And the last point I would make, which my colleague Mike Gallagher, the former congressman from Wisconsin, wrote in the pages of the Wall Street Journal recently, is maybe looking at cost plus contracting as a way to get more bang for our buck. So all of those elements, along with studying the Ukrainian war effort, which they are so eager to share with us, can really improve our performance on the battlefield.
Thank you, Dr. Polyakova. The same sort of question to you, if I might. His reference to 12 different tanks on the continent. The Ukrainians have done a masterful job of managing to service and to keep in the fight a remarkable array of armored personnel carriers and tanks and artillery pieces, dozens of different systems, despite not having the OEM and long supply chain that we insist is necessary. They've MacGyvered their way into capable fighting forces, not just drones, but across all these platforms. What lessons are there for us about our procurement, and what lessons are there for NATO? We're about to go to a NATO summit where Europe's pledged nearly $1 trillion in defense spending. What are the opportunities here for joint production and for speeding innovation?
Well, Senator, thank you for that question, and you point to a core issue that I raised in my written testimony as well. I'll just summarize. One, you're right, the Ukrainians are operating something like over 400 different kinds of systems from different places, some domestically produced, many from foreign partners, and that's been incredible to see. I think the main lesson for us is, one, we have to simplify our foreign military sales. If we really want to take advantage of what's happening in Ukraine, the big question that our European partners have, from the defense industry in particular, is how do we actually do joint ventures and co-development, co-production with U.S. defense industrial base? It is incredibly difficult. ITAR is a huge issue, as you know. On top of that, I think NATO needs to really push forward in joint procurement, which is part of the answer to your question about how do you translate money into capabilities, because money isn't everything. It has to be spent in the right things in the right ways, and NATO is the right framework to coordinate those efforts across the alliance to make sure this complementarity, not duplication.
I just traveled to the Philippines and Taiwan with Senator Ricketts. The upcoming NATO summit does not include Indo-Pacific partners, I think a significant mistake. How do you think the lessons of Ukraine can and should be learned or applied across some of our Indo-Pacific allies and partners?
May I answer the time? Thank you. That's a fantastic question that we started to discuss earlier. There is already a technology export vector that is taking place directly from Ukraine capabilities that are being learned on the ground by companies, the private sector, directly for export to Taiwan. That's already happening right now. My concern is the United States, we are missing out. And I will just point to Ukraine's recent operation. I think you saw the spiderweb operation, and we cannot defend against that operation. I don't know, because I'm not privy to that information. I don't know if we can carry it out, that kind of operation in a country like Russia. So I think that is all a huge opportunity for us to learn. And to your point about the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater being inexplicably linked is the key point. And Taiwan is very, very interested in buying directly from those defense tech companies that have capabilities they've tested in the battlefield and that they have been able to innovate in a super, super rapid fashion. And they're buying those capabilities as we speak. We should be too, but we need to do a lot of work to simplify that through FMS in particular.
Thank you. Now, Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you. And thank both of you for your testimony here. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Polyakova. It's good to see you again. I want to talk about what message we should aim to have come out of the NATO summit with respect to Ukraine, because the messages that the Trump administration has been sending for months, in my view, have undermined our position, our collective U.S.-NATO position in support of Ukraine. We don't have to revisit the spectacle in the Oval Office with President Zelensky and all those other issues. But more recently, we've seen Secretary Rubio acknowledge that Ukraine's need for air defense is significant. But to my knowledge, there's no plan to get Ukraine more air defense. We also saw Secretary Hegseth skip the Ukraine Defense Contact Group meeting in Brussels, the first time a U.S. Secretary of Defense has done so since Russia's full-scale invasion began in 2022. Secretary Hegseth also confirmed that the proposed 2026 budget request includes cuts to funding for weapons purchases to Ukraine. As you mentioned, with respect to the possibility of Ukraine's future, home in NATO, taking that off the table unilaterally is a pretty bad negotiating position. So could you just describe what message you think needs to come out of NATO summit with respect to Ukraine, what kind of united message, and then whether you think what the prospects are for that, given what President Trump's position's been?
Well, we understand that this summit has a much shorter agenda than usual NATO summits, that the communique is also going to be quite short and very simple and straightforward, really focusing on NATO's core capabilities and not talking necessarily so much about our other partners and allies. What I would like to see is, of course, clear messaging from the administration that we will stand with Ukraine against the Russian aggressor. That's what I would like to see. That being said, I think we can probably get to a communique that does mention that Russia's the aggressor, of course, and that Ukraine is the victim and also a partner to the United States. That's what I'm hoping for. Whether it'll be viable, I think will depend a lot on the conversations between leaders on the ground, as we've seen in the past. I think one very specific thing that I think this NATO summit could achieve, which is not necessarily to NATO but to Ukraine, is to allow the U.S. Sales of U.S. military equipment to Europeans who can then transfer it to Ukraine as they see fit. We have not provided that yet, that third-party transfer, but that's something that I think is very much within reach and something that we can do, and that in itself would send a clear message that even though we may not be debating a new supplemental in this House, though I hope that that may change, that the United States will still allow European allies to buy American and then transfer those capabilities to Ukraine.
I appreciate that. Let me ask both of you now quickly on the subject of coordinating both with our NATO partners, but also more broadly with the EU partners in terms of our approach to China, right? During the first Trump administration, we worked on a bipartisan basis to try to encourage our colleagues to de-risk their economies from China, especially in critical strategic supply chains. There seems to be more confusion this time around in the Trump administration. I would note that on June 10th, our ambassador to NATO, Matthew Whitaker, posted on X, quote, "What happens in the Indo-Pacific matters for transatlantic security. That's why NATO works with partners globally," end quote, something I agree with. But the Deputy Secretary of State, Landau, then posted and then deleted a reply. His tweet, though, was he obviously didn't get the memo of our deputies committee meeting on this very issue. NATO is still a solution in search of a problem, unquote. What is your view on these sort of different conflicting positions we seem to see within the Trump administration, and how is that hurting our ability to work with our European allies? And finally, when we're putting these large tariffs, across-the-board tariffs on many of our EU partners, and the question is, how can we be asking them to de-risk from China when we and our actions are putting their economies at such risk?
Thank you for your question, Senator. Again, I think the messaging, as you say, has not been clear to European allies on a variety of different issues, including tariffs, including our commitment to Ukraine, including our policy on China. I do think it's early in the administration, and we can allow them a little bit more time to figure out what those positions are. That being said, it is producing a great deal of stress and anxiety among allies to not really have a clear sense of where the administration is going to take its policies. So I would like to see very clear messaging on NATO in particular. I agree with some other members of the administration who said if we didn't have NATO, we'd have to invent it. So NATO does have a very clear purpose, is to defend and deter Russia in Europe, and to allow for lessons to be learned from the Indo-Pacific. NATO's core function is Europe, but there are many lessons that we've been discussing here for the Indo-Pacific environment, and to provide some key technologies and capabilities as well. That's what I would like to see come out of the summit, is coherence and a common threat assessment of what NATO is actually doing and why we have it.
If Mr. Rao could be able to.
I would just say, rather than grand pronouncements, what really matters is just the hard work, the daily grind of cleaning Chinese infrastructure out of the critical areas in Europe. I think the Chinese have, or Chinese-controlled companies have, stakes in 33 port terminals across Europe. CK Hutchinson, thanks in part to President Trump's pressure campaign, is now considering selling 14 of them to a U.S., Swiss, Italian consortium. Chinese are all over the ports of Rotterdam, Antwerp, have a 24.9% stake in the port of Hamburg. All of that just needs to be steadily worked on because it does have carryover effects, for example, military mobility and American troop movements in Europe. I'd also add telecoms to that list. None of the big EU countries are expected to have 5G networks that are entirely free of Chinese products by 2028. We need to try to accelerate those timelines to the extent we can. And that might go below the radar of sort of the grand political declarations at a place like The Hague next week, but I think it's essential for the alliance.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you both.
Thank you, Senator Van Hollen. Senator Booker.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I want to just say that you had, Ms. Polyakova, you had a kind of a statement that I want to explore a little bit. You said Russia would be a sitting duck without the United States. It makes me concerned because I hear the president publicly flirting with indulging Russia's maximalist aims, and it seems to make me really, really alarmed. Last week, a Russian deputy foreign minister said that Ukraine won't end until NATO reduces or eliminates its military footprint in Eastern Europe across NATO's eastern flank. This includes Baltic states, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and so on. When I was in Estonia, their concerns for the U.S. alliance and partnership, especially under the Trump administration, had many people I talked with very alarmed. And so I'm wondering if you can expand on this line of thought and maybe impress upon this committee the urgency, the dire urgency of this moment we have right now before us with Russia and with a president whose posture at times really worries me.
Thank you so much, Senator Booker. It is an urgent moment, as I outlined in my written testimony, mainly because Russia is on a war footing and confrontation with NATO seems increasingly more inevitable unless the United States continues to take up a leadership position. NATO continues to deter and defend in the European theater. So Russia has, in fact, been the main obstacle to peace in Ukraine. President Putin's maximalist positions that he's not stepped away from, I think signal a very basic truth that we've learned over many administrations, that a reset with Russia doesn't get you anywhere. I think this administration has been learning that, in fact, and like other administrations have tried to reset with Russia. And I hope that they will pivot to a different strategy. That means that we need to apply pressure to the Russians to come to the table. Economic pressure, military pressure, and also pressure on their partners and allies that have been feeding Putin's war machine over the last several years. I hope that is the thinking that the administration is going to pursue the next several months, because obviously the incentive model has not worked to produce results.
And my staff corrected me for the record that I said Russia, but Europe would be a sitting duck. And so you said that your view of the Trump administration is that they understand the urgency for the American engagement and involvement. Am I right to assume that that's what you were implying?
To be frank, I don't know if that is the coherent view of everyone in the U.S. government and in the executive branch. I do think there are some, certainly, that understand the threat, yes.
It's very diplomatic of you. I want to shift in my remaining time and talk about sort of the Arctic strategy. I was really surprised on my visit last year to Iceland to understand the extent of the urgencies and the need for America to have a greater Arctic strategy and pay close attention to really what's happening in the Arctic right now. The shortest flight path between Russia and the United States is through the Arctic. The combination of melting ice caps, as you know, critical natural resources being removed and fought over, Russia's military buildup and increasing cooperation between Russia and China in the Arctic have really a lot of potential to increase tensions and expose a lot of the vulnerabilities in that area. Now, Sweden and Finland joining NATO provides to what I believe is just a great boost to the collective defense in the high north. Now, 7 of the 8 Arctic states are part of NATO, which is an incredible stride, I believe. Russia's ghost fleets that sabotage undersea cables and critical infrastructure to protecting strategic ports. I just believe we need to expand NATO's capabilities. Now, I'll tell you, I was hearing reports when I was there that the Chinese have been doing, pun intended, fishy things in that area. And so I'm wondering from both of you, what new and emerging capabilities should NATO be considering when it comes to protecting allied interests in the Arctic? And are there gaps, as you see them, in NATO's current approach to challenges in the Arctic?
I was hoping somebody would ask a question about the Arctic. I hope you might come with us again to the Arctic this August. I'll be in touch about that. That being said, you're absolutely right that we have a huge opportunity with the kind of strategic depth that Finland and Sweden joining the alliances provides us. Now we have a landmass connecting the Arctic Sea and the Baltic Sea, and we haven't quite understood what the opportunity there is to deter and defend. I think we have significant challenges in our logistics operations, communications that are well suited for that harsh environment that we haven't quite thought through. I think there's a huge amount more that we can do to ensure that we have a defense and security hub that is closely coordinated with the Nordic-Baltic 8 grouping, that is closely coordinated with the NATO framework to position ourselves as the Arctic nation the United States is, and China is not in particular. The Chinese have for years seen significant interests emerge for themselves in the Arctic and have declared themselves a near polar or near Arctic nation, which of course they're not. And they're doing a lot through their proxies, the Russians now, to try to plant a flag and try to influence and undermine a strategic cohesion in the Arctic. But we have the upper hand there because now the 7 of the 8 Arctic states are NATO members, and we should take advantage of that. But I think exercises, number 1, logistics and comms, number 2, and then we can think about maybe positioning of some additional resources and kit in the region.
Mr. Rao?
You are right, Senator. This is a real opportunity. At the Madrid Summit in 2022, the Arctic was mentioned for the first time in the NATO Summit communique. In 2010, at the last time, or it's not the communique, the strategic compass, strategic policy document for the alliance. The last go-round, the alliance could not agree because the Norwegians wanted more NATO. The Canadians wanted to keep this a national issue. We now have more consensus in the alliance, and we've seen the Nordic powers really begin to work more with one another as well. It's the first time since the Kalmar Union of the 16th century that all the Nordic powers are in one alliance, which is a real opportunity. And there I would just say that the Arctic Council is essentially dead, but the Arctic 7 are all in NATO, and we have capabilities that have now come on board. The Finns are world leaders in in icebreaker design. They have all the Arctic powers, skills in cold weather operations. And I'd like to see us cooperate more also on Russian anti-submarine capabilities and exercises. The GI-UK gap is, of course, central here, where Russians from Murmansk try to break out from the Norwegian Sea into the Atlantic, where they can threaten the American Atlantic seaboard. And Tony Radakin, the Chief of Staff of the British Armed Forces, just a few years ago, right before the outbreak of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, described the phenomenal increase in Russian submarine activity. In April, General Kavoli, the SACEUR, testified similarly in front of the House Armed Services Committee. These are areas ripe for more cooperation. I'd like to see us work more with the Arctic 7 within the NATO alliance, and probably leave the Arctic Council, which of course includes Russia, in its latent state.
Thank you very much. That urgency is something I'd love the committee to focus a little bit more on. And I want to say I've never seen, Mr. Rao, I've never seen a witness throw my staff under the bus. They didn't put in my briefing document about the Arctic, the Calmer Treaty of 16th century. I'm going to be on my staff very upset about that lack of in my briefing.
Well, what I am struck by, Senator Booker, is the similarity in approach that both of our witnesses have today, which I think speaks to the importance of NATO and how we should respond. I actually want to do another round before we close, because I want to start, Mr. Rao, with asking you about the idea of a financial or a finance ministerial for NATO, because I think that's a really interesting idea as we think about how we really shut down our adversaries. It's not just militarily, it also needs to be economically. And one of the huge loopholes that exists is the ability for cryptocurrencies to pay for what our adversaries are doing, but also their ability to put their laundered money into our Western financial system. So talk a little bit about how you see that ministerial being structured, and the extent to which NATO has, to this point, discussed this idea and what the challenges are.
Well, for starters, NATO really is run by 5 defense ministerials that take place during the course of the year. And I don't know when it became written in stone, Senator, that we have to have an annual NATO summit. There were, I think, 3 summits all through the Cold War. They're enormously time-consuming. They're expensive. Moving the president to The Hague alone is a big undertaking. They create a lot of bureaucratic angst, and at times they can even be counterproductive as bureaucrats run around the corridors in Brussels looking for low-hanging fruit to pluck to put into a communique. So I think letting the defense ministers run NATO as they have in the past, and supplementing it with the finance ministerial, only because defense ministers oftentimes can't make budgeting promises the way that finance ministers actually have to. Moreover, I was heartened to see Mark Rutte, either in the press conference following his Chatham House remarks last week or after the defense ministerial, say that he will have annual plans as the allies ascend the step stair to 5%, to keep them to it, because it's very easy as a politician, I think, to make a 10-year horizon plan when your successor actually has to find a way to pay for it. So I think this is just a way to actually put brass tacks behind the pronouncements that are made, to force allies to really concentrate on how they will make their way there. And I would welcome the inclusion of some of these other components, like, for example, or the implications of cryptocurrency. How do banking systems, traditionally a domain of the European Union and the member states, play when it comes to NATO security and defense? How should we think about all of this? And I think that's a worthy area for investigation. And before I get in trouble, Senator, I should mention this idea I've stolen from a colleague of mine, Luke Coffey at Hudson Institute, who shared it with me some time ago.
We will give him attribution. Dr. Polyakova, do you want to add to that as you think about this potential?
No, I would just add that many European NATO member states, including Germany, traditionally the defense ministry has played a relatively minor role, and it's really been the finance ministry that has led the way and has had a powerful head. Like, nobody wanted a defense ministry in German politics for years. So I think now is the moment to rebalance that, and I think this is a very good idea that I'm just hearing for the first time, actually. But I think it makes a lot of sense for Europeans in particular, because the money is going to have to be allocated. It's going to come from somewhere, and who controls those purse strings? Well, it's parliaments, but it's really the finance ministers.
And to what extent has this been discussed? Are you aware of any conversations about this? Any particular NATO member who is pushing this idea?
I don't believe so, Senator. I think this is still a somewhat nascent, incipient concept.
Interesting. Well, I think it's a great idea. I think we should think about how we push it. Dr. Polyakova, and you and Mr. Rao both mentioned the hybrid threat from Russia to our NATO allies. Can you expand on that a little bit? Because one of the things that has struck me is that it is an area that we have, particularly around the information space, where we have not at all either been able or willing to match what our adversaries are doing. And we've heard that applies not just to the United States, but to other NATO countries. So can I ask both of you to speak to that and to what more we ought to be thinking about there?
No, thank you so much, Senator, for that question. I will preface my answer to your specific question on the information influence operations to say that what Russia is currently carrying out against our European allies in NATO, we have not seen even the Cold War. It's not even hybrid or non-conventional. This is warfare. We call it, in my institution, shadow warfare, because it does include assassinations. It does include very well-documented attacks on critical infrastructure that is costing lives and producing mass civilian as well as military disruption and destruction. And this is something very new that we have not grasped as an alliance and that we must. I think increasingly information influence operations are even less needed, I would say, because the Russians have unleashed their intelligence agencies to wreak havoc across Europe in all these other various ways. That being said, they haven't gone anywhere, certainly not. I mean, the use of propaganda-type tools has been around for all of humanity and was effectively used by the Russians. I think the unfortunate situation we find ourselves in now is that I think with some of the cuts that the administration has made and also that Congress has not, for example, reconstituted funding the Global Engagement Center as one, but also some of the cuts to VOA, RFE, are diminishing our ability to compete in the information space. I think there's no question about that, not just in Europe, but across the world. And I hope that's something that we may reconsider in the near term.
I certainly agree. Mr. Rao?
Yeah, just maybe on the Baltic Sea, since it's much in the news, this is a vast body of water. Something like 15% of global traffic transits it, and it's very shallow at 52 or 55 meters, which means it's rather inexpensive for part of Russia's shadow fleet to drag a rusty anchor across its seabed and destroy data transmission or communications or even power cables. A third of the EU's natural gas is imported via undersea pipelines from Norway, for example, which could prove rather damaging to the economy. And to repair these data cables, transmission lines, is rather expensive, somewhere between 5 to 10 to 150 to $200 million. There's only 60, 70, 80 repair vehicles available in the world. All of this is a huge problem, which means that really, when it comes to the balance of threat, the Russians know the political economy works in their direction. It's inexpensive and it's expensive for us, which I do think means, as much as I hate to say it, that we should consider countermeasures to try to put the Russians on their back heel. Maybe it's worthwhile considering the lights going off in the Moscow metro for half a day or something like that to send a message to Vladimir Putin. He cannot act with impunity and just expect us to play defense all of the time. That's just not going to be an effective way for us to go forward.
I totally agree with that. I thought it was very interesting. I think it was Finland who the last time the undersea cables were interrupted in the Baltic Sea, took the ship and all of its crew into port and arrested them, basically, and said, we're not going to let you get away with it. We've got to get much tougher on those kinds of measures. Well, thank you both very much for being here. We really appreciate your testimony and the ideas that you've shared with us. I don't think that we'll have any questions for the record, but if we do, we would ask that you might be willing to respond to those as quickly as possible. So with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.